was a mystery for more than 2 decades. Whatever happened to 10-year-old Natasha Alex Carter and her mother Susan?
There are cases where a killer is caught, tried, and sentenced. There are cases where the evidence takes decades to surface, but eventually lands in a courtroom. And then there are cases that refuse to follow any of those routes. Cases where the man responsible spends 24 years pretending he knows nothing. Watches investigators circle closer with every passing year. Waits out a failing body. And then, only when he is hours from death, decides to speak. August 2000. Beckley, West Virginia. A city of roughly 17,000 people, sitting in the coal fields of Raleigh County. The kind of place where neighborhoods know each other, where news travels fast, where the disappearance of a mother and her 10-year-old daughter on a quiet summer evening would not go unnoticed. And it didn't. People noticed. Police were called. Investigators built files. Tips were followed. Rewards were posted. And for 24 years, none of it produced the one thing that mattered. The bodies of Susan Carter and her daughter Natasha, who everyone who loved her called Alex. What separated this case from most cold cases was not simply the length of time it remained unsolved. It was the fact that the man who had killed them both never left. He stayed in the same house. He gave interviews to local news when investigators searched his property. He told reporters he had dementia and could not remember. He watched law enforcement dig through his yard, and he kept his mouth closed. Until the first week of April 2024, when a prosecuting attorney walked into a nursing home room and sat down across from an 82-year-old man who had run out of time. Susan Carter was 41 years old in the summer of 2000. She was a mother navigating one of the hardest situations a parent faces. A contentious, escalating custody dispute over her daughter with Alex's father, Rick Lafferty. The battle had grown fierce enough that Susan had told Lafferty directly that he would never see his daughter again. Whether that was anger or intent, it was the kind of remark that would cause investigators to move in exactly the wrong direction for years. Natasha Carter was 10 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, 4 feet 2 inches tall, 50 pounds. Her family called her Alex, always Alex. The name stuck so completely that in every news report, every FBI flyer, and every missing persons database entry across the 24 years that followed, she would be listed as Natasha Alex Carter. According to her grandmother, Alex was afraid of her mother's living situation. She had expressed that she did not want to be living in the home on Kyle Lane. She was 10 years old and the adults around her were making decisions she had no power to change. By August 2000, Susan and Alex were living full-time in the Mabscott area of Raleigh County at a property on Kyle Lane, the home of Larry Webb, Susan's romantic partner. On or around August 8, 2000, they were seen alive for the last time. After that date, neither Susan nor Alex Carter appeared anywhere. Not in any record, not in any database, not in any account from anyone who knew them. When Susan and Alex failed to surface in the days following August 8th, the absence carried an immediate complication that would shape the next 2 decades of this case. Susan had been in an active custody dispute. She had told Alex's father he would never see his daughter. She was known to have used the name Susan Gale Carter Webb, and she and Alex had been living at a private residence where law enforcement had no immediate reason to execute a search. The most logical reading of the facts in the summer of 2000 was that Susan had taken Alex and left. A parental abduction rather than something worse. That interpretation hardened into an official position. In November 2000, nearly 3 months after the pair were last seen, the state issued a felony kidnapping warrant for Susan Carter. FBI missing persons flyers circulated with Susan listed not as a victim, but as an abductor. Alex's photo appeared alongside language indicating she may have been taken out of state. Investigators noted that Larry Webb, the man whose home they had been living in, remembered being away on a trip when they disappeared. He said he thought he had called police. He said he had cooperated fully. He said he had loved Susan deeply. He said all of this. And for years, the abduction theory provided enough structural logic to keep investigators looking outward rather than at the property on Kyle Lane. Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, did not accept the abduction theory. He spent years pushing law enforcement not to close off other possibilities. He had no evidence of his own. He had no authority to direct an investigation. He had only the certainty of a father who believed his daughter was not running, and no one in a position to act was yet ready to agree with him. The case went cold. Not immediately. There were years of effort, years of follow-up, years during which the FBI and West Virginia State Police periodically revisited the file and found nothing new to act on. But gradually, the active energy behind the investigation diminished. Susan and Alex Carter remained on the FBI's missing persons list. But a listing is not an investigation. A listing is not the same as anyone actively searching. Larry Webb remained at 126 Kyle Lane in the Mabscott area of Beckley. He lived in the same house throughout the early 2000s, through the 2010s, and into the 2020s. Neighbors came and went. The property on Kyle Lane sat on an ordinary residential street, distinguishable from nothing. If Webb experienced guilt during those years, he did not allow it to alter his external behavior. He had given investigators what he needed to give them in 2000, and then he waited. For Rick Lafferty, the years were not neutral. They were active and accumulative in their weight. He continued to press the case whenever he could, whenever law enforcement would hear him, whenever a new investigator took interest, whenever a renewed media cycle put Alex's face back in front of the public. He attended every press conference. He contacted every agency that would return his calls. He said later that the case went cold so many times he almost gave up hope on more than one occasion. Almost. He never fully stopped. And that distinction, the space between almost stopping and actually stopping, is part of what kept this case breathing. In December 2021, 21 years after Susan and Alex Carter were last seen alive, the FBI's Pittsburgh field office announced a renewed and formal push to find answers. The announcement came with a reward of $10,000 for information. Agents identified FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jennifer King as the lead investigator. She was paired with Corporal Ryan Stowers of the West Virginia State Police. The two of them began rebuilding the case from the ground up, not from the conclusions established in 2000, from the physical evidence that had never been fully exhausted. That distinction mattered immediately. When King and Stowers examined what had actually been documented at the scene in 2000 and in the years that followed, they identified threads that had not been fully pulled. The property at Kyle Lane, the house where Susan and Alex had been living, the house where Webb had been living ever since, became the center of their attention. Not the surrounding area, not a theory about Susan fleeing the state, the house itself. In 2022, investigators executed a search warrant at Webb's home for the first time. They moved through the property with the methodical attention of a team that believed the answer was inside the structure. Then they came back in 2023 with a second warrant. During one of these searches, something was found that changed the entire orientation of the case. Inside a bedroom known to have been occupied by 10-year-old Alex Carter, embedded in the wall behind the baseboard, hidden in the space between the wall surface and the floor, the kind of place that only a precise, deliberate forensic search would ever think to examine. Investigators recovered a bullet. That bullet was sent to the FBI laboratory. The results came back. The blood on that bullet belonged to Alex Carter. A bullet embedded behind a baseboard in a child's bedroom, 23 years old, still carrying biological material that matched a 10-year-old girl who had been reported as a possible kidnapping victim in the year 2000. The implications of that result were total and immediate. Alex Carter had not been taken across state lines by her mother. Alex Carter had not disappeared voluntarily. Alex Carter had been shot inside the house where she was living, inside the bedroom she had slept in. And the man who had owned that house for the entire duration of the 23 years between August 2000 and the moment investigators pulled that bullet from the wall had been present throughout. In October 2023, a grand jury in Raleigh County indicted Larry Webb for the murder of Natasha Carter. He was in his early 80s by then. His health had been declining for some time. He had been living with reported cognitive decline. His caretaker had told reporters that Webb had dementia. Webb himself, when interviewed by local news outlets during the 2023 search warrant execution, when investigators were actively working through his property, had said to the cameras that he did not know what had happened to Susan and Alex, that he did not remember the day they disappeared, that he had loved Susan with all of his heart. The indictment answered the question of what investigators believed. It did not produce an immediate arrest. Webb's medical condition made incarceration complicated. The legal process of medically clearing him for custody took months. During that period, the reward in the case was raised from $10,000 to $20,000. Investigators continued working to assemble everything they would need to take the case to trial. A trial that, as the calendar moved into early 2024, was becoming increasingly uncertain. By early April 2024, it was clear that the window for a traditional prosecution was closing. Not because of evidence, not because of legal procedure, because Larry Webb was dying. He was 82 years old. He had been in a medical facility for an extended period. His physical condition had deteriorated to the point where the legal system's standard requirements for incarceration had required special medical clearance before he could be formally taken into custody. That clearance was finally issued in the first days of April. On April 12, 2024, Webb was placed under arrest. He was transported to the Southern Regional Jail and then to Mount Olive Correctional Complex. He was held without bond. Before that arrest was finalized in the first week of April, while investigators still had the ability to interview him, Raleigh County Prosecuting Attorney Ben Hatfield and other officials traveled to Hilltop Nursing Home Center to speak directly with Webb. What happened in that room produced something investigators had spent 24 years working toward, Larry Webb confessed. Not a partial admission, not a carefully hedged statement designed to preserve legal options. Hatfield would later describe it as a detailed, undeniable, unconflicted confession that aligned precisely with the physical evidence collected from the property across multiple years of investigation. Webb told them everything. He said he shot Susan Carter after an argument about money, finances he believed she had mismanaged or spent without his knowledge. He said the moment he pulled the trigger, he knew, in his own words, that he had ruined his life forever. And then he told investigators what happened next. What he did after he understood that a 10-year-old girl had witnessed everything. He killed Alex Carter to prevent her from telling anyone what she had seen. That was the calculation. A 10-year-old child in her own home, in the bedroom she slept in, was shot to eliminate her as a witness to her mother's murder. Webb told investigators he understood immediately what he had done and what it meant. According to the prosecuting attorney's account of the confession, Webb said that after shooting both Susan and Alex, he sat with what he had done. He cried himself to sleep that night. The next morning he began digging, not quickly, methodically. Over the course of 2 full days in the wooded area at the back of his property on Kyle Lane. Before the grave was ready, he wrapped both bodies in bed linens and left them on the basement floor. When the hole was deep enough, he carried them out and buried them together in the same unmarked grave. He covered the site. He returned to his life. He stayed in the house. He answered questions when they came. He repeated that he did not know what had happened. He said he had loved Susan. He said he missed them both. He did all of this for 24 years. The confession, when it finally came, was not the product of remorse arriving on its own timeline. Webb was on his deathbed. He was in a nursing home. He had been indicted. The arrest had already happened. The DNA evidence from Alex's bedroom wall had already been documented and presented to a grand jury. The legal structure around him had tightened to the point where speaking or staying silent produced roughly the same outcome, with one exception. Speaking gave the families the location of the grave. And on some level, in that nursing home room in April 2024, that appears to be what finally moved him to talk. On April 22, 2024, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, Larry Webb suffered a medical episode at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. He was transported to Montgomery General Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. He was 82 years old. He had been in custody for 10 days. At that same moment, while Webb was in transport, while the medical staff at Montgomery General were working on an 82-year-old man who had carried a 24-year secret to within hours of his grave, investigators and excavation teams were at the Kyle Lane property in Mabscott on their 3rd day of digging. A local landscaper who lived just a few doors down had been brought in to assist. The work was slow, physical, and precise. Webb had provided the location during his confession. Investigators had brought him to the property on April 9th in an attempt to help direct the search, but his physical condition had made it impossible for him to give specific guidance. The teams worked from his verbal description, digging through the backyard of a house that had stood in an ordinary residential neighborhood for the entirety of those 24 years. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, 6 hours after Larry Webb was pronounced dead, The excavation teams found what they had been looking for: the remains of Susan Carter and Natasha Alex Carter, buried together in the same shallow grave, wrapped exactly as Webb had described. The prosecuting attorney noted that the confession and the physical recovery confirmed each other completely, leaving no room for any other interpretation of what had happened on or around August 8, 2000, at 126 Kyle Lane. The man who put them there died 6 hours before they were found. Not a minute of accountability, not a single day in a courtroom. The next day, April 23, 2024, West Virginia State Police held a press conference in Beckley. Investigators, prosecutors, and FBI officials stood before the cameras and explained everything that had happened across the previous 24 hours. Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, the man who had spent 24 years refusing to stop asking, was in the room. FBI agents presented him with something they had recovered from the property during the investigation: Alex's necklace. He held it and stood in front of the cameras and said that it was a sad day and also a happy day. He said he could finally bring his baby home. He said the case had gone cold so many times across those years that he had almost lost hope on more than one occasion. And then he said the only thing a parent in that position can say that means anything to anyone else who has ever been in a position like it: never give up. Never give up hope of finding your child.
Kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I could bring my baby home. It's been on 24 years. This case went cold so many times that, I almost lost hope several times. But I can tell anybody that's in my position, just never give up. Never give up hope of finding your child. I mean, somebody knows something, that the help of these fine people here, she may never have been found, especially where we did find her, it was in a place that was just inaccessible nearly. It was just... So, every time I would drive down the freeway, I would get a feeling, when I drive by that place, that's maybe where she was.
Susan Carter was 41 years old when she died. Alex Carter was 10. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and a scar on her left eyebrow, and a nickname her family gave her that became the only name anyone who loved her ever used. She had been afraid of the situation she was living in. She had had no way out of it. And she had spent 24 years listed in a federal database as a possible abduction victim, a category that, for 2 decades, kept the investigation looking in a direction that led away from the place where she and her mother had actually been the entire time. Larry Webb died in a hospital bed without facing a jury. He did not get a verdict. What he got instead was an empty house, a confession that cost him nothing legally, and 6 hours. The necklace, however, came home. It sits now with Rick Lafferty, a small piece of metal and chain that a 10-year-old girl wore around her neck in the summer of 2000. It outlasted the lies. It outlasted the man who told them. And it will outlast everything else.